Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. Welcome to our webinar focused on version 4.1 of the What Works Clearinghouse Standards and Procedures Handbook. I am Sarah Caverly with the American Institutes for Research and a Deputy Director for the What Works Clearinghouse Statistics website and training contract. We are looking forward to sharing updates to the standards and procedures with you and excited to see that we have a broad audience comprised of WWC reviewers, school district and state leaders, researchers, as well as members of the IES team. If you have not done so, please introduce yourself in the chat box. Our webinar will be led by two presenters, Drs. Joe Taylor and Jeff Valentine. Both are members of our What Works Clearinghouse Statistics website and training team. Dr. Taylor is a principal researcher at the American Institutes for Research, as well as an assistant professor in the College of Education at the University of Colorado Springs. Dr. Valentine is a co-principal investigator on the What Works Clearinghouse Statistics website and training contract and has served as the principal investigator for the reviews, reporting, dissemination, and development contract with the What Works Clearinghouse. He is a professor in the College of Education and Human Development at the University of Louisville. Both have been engaged in the refinement of the What Works Clearinghouse's protocols, standards, and procedures. On today's webinar, the presenters will share information on 4 substantive updates to the version 4.1 procedures, including the estimation of effect sizes when multiple effects are present in a single domain, using fixed effects meta-analysis for synthesizing effects across multiple studies, a new approach to effectiveness ratings within intervention reports, and calculating effect sizes within single case design studies. The team will also describe other notable updates to version 4.1 of the What Works Clearinghouse Standards and Procedures Handbook. Today's webinar is part of a series of events to introduce version 4.1 and will provide a broad overview of the updates. We've also created a summary of changes that is available on the What Works Clearinghouse website and developed a separate video to support the recertification of What Works Clearinghouse reviewers on the version 4.1 standards and procedures that will be available at the end of January. Finally, the online group design training modules and certification process will transition into version 4.1 this spring. We will be sharing additional information about the recertification process near the end of the webinar. Throughout the webinar, we will be sharing links to resources within the chat box. We will also be monitoring the chat box for questions. Near the end of the webinar, presenters will respond to questions. While we may not be able to address all questions during the webinar, responses to questions received will be included in the webinar archive materials posted to the What Works Clearinghouse website. Before we get started, I would like to provide a brief overview of the history of the What Works Clearinghouse standards and how they have evolved. The What Works Clearinghouse standards have been in place since 2002 and were made publicly available as a handbook in May 2008 with the release of Handbook 1.0. Over the past 18 years, IES has refined the What Works Clearinghouse standards and procedures based on consultations with the statistical, technical, and analysis team, which includes consultants as well as key staff from the What Works Clearinghouse contractors in collaboration with the National Center for Education Evaluation and Regional Assistance, the National Center for Special Education Research, and the National Center for Education Research. The What Works Clearinghouse also sought input from the public about the proposed updates. The version 4.1 updates were guided by the rigorous review process and were finalized by IES and made publicly available on January 6, 2020. With that, I'll turn the webinar over to our first presenter, Dr. Valentine, who will walk us through the substantive changes within version 4.1.
Thank you, Sarah, and welcome everyone. I'm really happy to be able to be with you today. And if you're listening to an archived version of the webinar, welcome as well. The first update that we'd like to discuss relates to the fact that it is common for studies that the WWC reviews to have multiple effect sizes in the same outcome domain. Let me start by defining the term outcome domain. As you can see on the slide, you can think of an outcome domain as a set of conceptually and empirically related outcome measures. So, for example, a study of beginning reading might have several measures of alphabetics, and a study of middle school students might have several measures of academic achievement. In general, reporting multiple measures in the same outcome domain is a good thing. This is because no measure is perfect, and having multiple measures allows us to assess the construct of interest more effectively. In previous versions of the What Works Clearinghouse procedures, we implicitly assumed that these multiple effect sizes were perfectly correlated. It turns out that this was a pretty cautious assumption, and if it is wrong, the procedure produces standard errors that are too large. This means, for example, that the WWC might be making too many type 2 errors, and if you recall, type 2 errors are those that are made when we don't reject a null hypothesis that is actually false and needs to be rejected. For the updated Procedures Handbook, the WWC investigated several different approaches to try to understand the trade-offs between type 1 error rates and statistical power. We concluded that if we can extract the relevant correlations between the measures from the studies, or if we can obtain these correlations from study authors, we can use this information to obtain a better estimate of the domain average effect size and its standard error. A good question is how much this actually matters. And so on this slide, we provide some examples so that you can see how it works out. The example is based on the assumption that we desire a type 1 error rate of alpha equals 0.05, and remember that this is very common in the social and medical sciences, and that typical statistical power in the studies that the WWC reviews is about 0.5. The bottom line is that the importance of the new procedure depends on the number of effects and on the actual correlations. So let's dig into the examples. There are 4 rows of data, and you can see that in the left 2 columns, we vary the number of effects, either 2 or 5, and the observed correlation, either 0.8 or 0.6. These values are typical for the studies that the WWC has reviewed. In the last 2 columns, you can see that we have 2 ways of expressing how much the old assumption that the effects were perfectly correlated matters. The first row has the best case of the 4 cases we have laid out. It has the smallest number of measures and the largest correlation between measures. In this case, the actual type 1 error rate is about 0.039. We're aiming for an actual type 1 error rate of 0.5, remember. So this means that in the best conditions that we have here, the approximate type 1 error rate is a little lower than the type 1 error rate that we were aiming for. The last row has the worst case of the 4 that we have laid out. It has the largest number of measures and the smallest correlation between the measures. And here, the actual type 1 error rate is about 0.017. Another way of saying this is that we would like to make a type 1 error rate about 5% of the time, but in this situation, we would be making a type 1 error rate around 1.5% of the time. And so in this case, the difference between the type 1 error rate that we were aiming for and the type 1 error rate that we actually generated using the old procedure is quite large. This slide shows how the new procedure works on an actual WWC reviewed study. You can see that this study has 2 effects in the same outcome domain, and you can see their effect sizes, and in the next column you can see the variances for the effect sizes and then the associated p-values in parentheses. If we assume that the correlation between those effects is perfect, which we did in the previous versions of the Procedures Handbook, then we would get a combined variance of about 0.118, and that would yield a p-value of about 0.19. The study indicated that the 2 measures are correlated at 0.75. So using the new procedure, we obtain a smaller variance of about 0.103, and note that this variance is about 15% smaller than the estimated variance using the old method. And this gives us a slightly smaller probability value of 0.17. This is not a large change because the characteristics of this study are similar to the best case that we outlined on the previous slide. If there had been more effects and/or a smaller correlation between the measures, we would have observed a larger difference in the results. So in summary, when a study has multiple effects in the same outcome domain, the new procedures allow us to be somewhat less cautious in our estimate of the variance of the combined effect size and this will result in somewhat fewer type 1 errors and greater statistical power. Now we'd like to move on to our second substantive change. WWC intervention reports and practice guides often involve a synthesis of multiple studies. We do this when more than one study assesses outcomes in the same domain. For example, 2 studies might assess college readiness using standardized tests like the SAT or the ACT. In earlier versions of the WWC procedures, the synthesis results were described using a modification of a method known as vote counting. As you can see on the slide, an intervention could receive an intervention rating of positive effects if at least 2 studies showed statistically significant positive effects and if some other conditions were met. I'll discuss these later. In the new version of the WWC procedures, we have moved to what is known as fixed effects meta-analysis. If you've ever read a meta-analysis, you might know that the fixed effects meta-analytic approach involves computing a weighted effect size. Technically, the fixed effects approach uses inverse variance weights, but the variance, and hence the weights, are a function of sample size. This means that larger studies get proportionally more weight in the analysis. As an example that compares the old to the new synthesis procedure, the WWC has an intervention report on summer counseling interventions that were designed to prevent summer melt. This is just the idea that for some high school graduates, their motivation to attend college diminishes over the summer. All of the studies in this intervention report met WWC group design standards without reservations. Under the old procedures, the intervention was rated as having mixed effects in the domain of college access and enrollment. I'll discuss the basis for this rating shortly. Here you can see the studies in the intervention report, their sample sizes, their effect sizes, and an indication of whether the effect sizes were statistically significant. The effect size you see at the bottom of the table in bold font is an unweighted average of the individual effect sizes. I'll pause here to give you just a moment to digest the table. On this slide, you can see the table from the previous slide, but this time with all of the information that one would need to do a fixed effects meta-analysis. You can see that the fixed effects meta-analytic average is a little smaller than the unweighted average, 0.08 versus 0.12. You can also see that this effect size is statistically significant. Previous versions of the WWC procedures did not identify a method for conducting a null hypothesis significance test of the unweighted effect size. So for people interested in the overall effect size's statistical significance, this will be a positive development. If these studies had been synthesized using the procedures articulated in the 4.1 handbook, the intervention rating would be positive effects because, as you can see on this slide, to get this rating, the intervention effect needs to be positive and statistically significant, and more than 50% of the meta-analytic weight has to be derived from studies that meet WWC standards without reservations. We'll talk more about this in just a moment. Finally, one question we've received is why the WWC adopted the fixed effects meta-analytic model instead of the random effects model. This is a pretty technical issue, but basically the problem is that to generate a reasonable random effects estimate, you need a large number of studies. Estimates are usually in the 10 to 15 study range. Having too few studies could lead to too many type 1 or to too many type 2 errors, and there's no way to know which one will happen. And so in cases like this, experts often recommend using the fixed effects model. As you can see here, the WWC's syntheses tend to be small. Of the 116 intervention reports that the WWC has produced that have at least 2 studies, most have 2 to 3 studies, and the maximum is 9. So for now, the WWC will need to continue to use the fixed effects model, though we are hopeful that the random effects model might become more viable as the WWC continues to grow. You can infer from the examples I've used that the What Works Clearinghouse assigns ratings to interventions that are summarized in intervention reports. The updated version of the Procedures Handbook articulates a new method for determining evidence of intervention effectiveness. I've already hinted at the major change. The WWC no longer uses a modified vote counting approach, but instead bases intervention effectiveness ratings on the fixed effects meta-analytic estimate. The next slides show both the version we used in previous iterations of the WWC procedures and the updated procedures. Now, as a warning, there's a lot of information embedded in the slides, and our goal really is to just provide you an overview of how the process works and how it used to work, so that you can get a better feel for how the new system looks and how things change from the old system. Under both the previous procedure and the new procedure, an intervention can have a rating of positive effects. As you can see on this slide, under the old system, we required that 3 conditions be met. First, at least 2 studies had to have statistically significant and positive effects. Next, at least 1 of those studies had to meet WWC standards without reservations. And finally, there could be no studies that had a negative effect that was either statistically significant or large enough to be substantively important. Under the new procedures, we require that at least 2 studies meet WWC standards at some level, that the weighted fixed effect size be both statistically significant and positive, and that more than 50% of the meta-analytic weight be derived from studies that meet WWC standards without reservations. As I mentioned earlier, the summer counseling interventions would receive a rating of positive effects under the updated procedure. So now that we've gone through this, we actually received a question about how the system works. The questioner asked this: if there are 2 studies in the synthesis, one of which meets standards without reservations and one of which meets standards with reservations, and the meta-analytic average is statistically significant and positive, what is the intervention rating? So as we've just seen, the intervention rating will depend on the percentage of the meta-analytic average that is attributable to the study that meets WWC standards without reservations. To repeat, the Procedures Handbook version 4.1 articulates that for an intervention to have a rating of positive effects, more than 50% of the meta-analytic weight has to be derived from studies that meet WWC standards without reservations. If there are only 2 studies, in almost all cases, this means that if the study that meets standards without reservations has the larger sample size, the intervention will have a rating of positive effects. I won't go over the next 2 slides in detail, but on this slide you can see that both systems have a potentially positive effects rating and the information that the 2 systems use to generate that rating. On this slide, let me just note that under the old procedures, the summer counseling intervention that I used as an example had a rating of mixed effects for the college access and enrollment domain. It received this rating because only 1 study had statistically significant positive effects, and because more studies showed indeterminate effects than showed statistically significant or substantively important effects. And so now I'd like to turn things over to Dr. Taylor, who will start by discussing changes to the way that the WWC reviews single case design studies.
Thank you, Dr. Valentine, and hello, everyone. The 4th substantive change that we will discuss today involves calculation of effect sizes from single case design studies. But first, let's begin with just a bit of background on single case designs. Single case design researchers typically conduct experiments where an outcome measure is assessed repeatedly, both within and across different phases or time intervals, and these intervals are defined by the presence or absence of an intervention. In single case designs, a case can be a student or a classroom, and the case is the unit to which the intervention is administered and removed. The case also serves as the unit of analysis. We'd like to begin by reviewing prior WWC practice as it pertains to extracting and synthesizing effects from single case designs, as well as characterizing the effectiveness of interventions whose impact has been studied with single case design. Typically, to extract an effect, prior practice has been for the WWC reviewers to conduct a visual analysis of graphically displayed findings, assessing whether an intervention effect had been clearly demonstrated. Then, before synthesizing a set of single case design effects, that set of effects had to pass a set of criteria called the 5-3-20 rule. The 5-3-20 rule states that a set of single case design studies will contribute to a WWC effectiveness rating only if at least 5 studies meet WWC single case design standards with or without reservations. The studies are conducted by at least 3 different research teams with no overlapping authorship at 3 different institutions, and the combined number of cases is at least 20. As a result of this practice, it was often the case that the set of single case designs used to study an intervention did not meet the 5-3-20 criteria, and therefore these effects did not contribute to the intervention's effectiveness rating. And in the cases where the 5-3-20 rule was satisfied, the review team would tally and compute the proportion of single case design effects that were positive or negative in direction. But there was no attempt then to synthesize these single case design effects with the effects from group design studies. Then, to arrive at the intervention's effectiveness rating, the prior WWC practice would be to apply the WWC effectiveness rating scheme to the proportion of observed positive effects. This prior practice of qualitatively characterizing an effect as positive or negative does not generate an effect size estimate. And the tallying of the positive and negative effects, which is the vote counting method Dr. Valentine described, is not consistent with the new WWC synthesis approach of fixed effects meta-analysis. Fortunately, recent methodological advances have resulted in effect size options for these single case designs. These effect sizes are designed to be comparable with standardized mean difference effect sizes from group designs, allowing single case design effects to be combined with each other and also with the effects from group designs. As such, these effect sizes are referred to as design comparable effect sizes and can be computed for single case designs with specific characteristics. First, the study must be a treatment reversal, multiple baseline, or multiple probe design. Also, the study must have 3 or more cases, where cases are usually individuals. And because meta-analyses that include single case design effects do not inherently require a minimum number of single case design studies, the 5-3-20 rule has been eliminated. Like the effects from other study designs, only effects from single case designs that meet standards are synthesized. This practice has not changed. However, now in standards version 4.1, there is an additional requirement for a single case design study to meet standards. Specifically, study authors are now required to submit raw data in graphical or tabular format. These raw data submitted by authors, at a minimum, must include the following variables in long format: the case ID, the measurement session or occasion, the phase indicator indicating baseline or intervention, and the outcome measure value associated with that measurement occasion. On this slide, we provide a visual cue for the required graphical or tabular data format. Note in the tabular data on the right that the data are in long format with the outcome measures and measurement occasions nested within each of the 3 cases. Also note the occasion-specific indicator for the baseline or treatment phase. Then, over in the graphical display on the left, we see the outcome versus occasion data, and they are represented in the 3 rows of graphs each corresponding to a case, and with the red and blue coloring indicating baseline and treatment phases, respectively. Then, once the raw data are obtained either directly from the author in tabular format or extracted to tabular format from a corresponding graphical display, tools now exist that can process those data, resulting in a design comparable effect size estimate and standard error. For example, the online R-Shiny app developed by James Pristiovsky at the University of Texas Austin and pictured here on the slide can process these tabular raw data as a text or CSV file, producing an effect size and standard error for use in a fixed effects meta-analysis. And while we're on this slide, I think it makes sense to address a good question that we received on this topic. The question read as follows: is the effect size generated from the D-CES, design comparable effect size, on the same scale as an effect size generated from a group design? And the answer is definitely yes. The design comparable effect size is in standard deviation units, which is the same scale as the standardized mean difference effect size that the WWC would calculate for a group design study. Let's go to the next slide. In addition to the 4 substantive changes that Dr. Valentine and I just discussed, there were a number of additional changes to the WWC Standards and Procedures version 4.1 that are also noteworthy, and I'll briefly touch on those in the next few slides. To begin, I will mention changes that apply to both the procedures and standards handbooks. The first change that applies to both handbooks is the removal of the substantively important designation. In the past, this qualitative designation was used for intervention effects that are 0.25 standard deviations or larger and that were not statistically significant. Second, the handbooks now include standard error formulas to accompany all of the corresponding effect size formulas that the WWC uses. These effect size standard errors computed using these formulas will then be used to weight effect sizes should those effects be synthesized in a fixed effects meta-analysis. Now let's discuss a few changes that apply only to the procedures handbook. First, there's new text that distinguishes the Standards for Excellence in Education Research, also referred to as the SEER principles, and distinguishes that work from that of the WhatWorks Clearinghouse. The SEER principles prioritize several dimensions of research excellence, such as documentation of core components of interventions and counterfactual conditions, as well as reporting of cost information. We won't discuss the SEER principles in detail here, but we do encourage you to find additional information about them at the URL provided on the slide. Finally, language has been added about the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA, tiers of evidence. This new language aligns with recent updates to the WWC website, where users can now incorporate ESSA tiers of evidence into their database searches. Additional changes that apply only to the procedures handbook include new procedures for prioritizing interventions for review. These new procedures are now more flexible, allowing the topic area protocols to identify criteria for selecting studies and determining eligibility. Another procedural change in this set specifies that the Education Resources Information Center, or ERIC, database should be used as the initial source of studies for WWC reviews, with then the topic area protocol specifying additional databases as needed. This next set of procedural changes pertain to the WWC's preferred sources of study information, as well as procedures around study eligibility. First, when multiple versions of a manuscript are available, the most recent version submitted to ERIC is now preferred. However, if no version is available in ERIC, the most recent published version is preferred. Also note on the slide that master's theses are now eligible to be reviewed by the WWC. And for any type of study, abstracts are now required to be screened for eligibility by 2 trained WWC staff whereas only one trained screener was required in the past. And continuing on, there is new language in the procedures that clarifies the purpose of author queries. This language indicates that the primary intent of an author query is to obtain information necessary to arrive at a study rating. However, for studies that meet standards, the query will also seek missing information about the study context. In addition, new language in the procedures explains that studies may be re-reviewed if they were previously reviewed under version 2.0 of the WWC standards or under a separate review protocol. Our final procedural update slide addresses the statistical considerations for different effect size estimates. First, the Procedures Handbook now includes guidance on how to calculate effect sizes for regression discontinuity designs. Also, detailed language has been added to the handbooks regarding calculating Hedges G for continuous outcomes and the Cox index for dichotomous outcomes. And finally, new text has been added indicating that the WWC will not compute a standard error for the difference in differences estimate when it is used with a dichotomous outcome measure. Now, this may change in the future when more clear guidance emerges from the literature on how to best estimate the standard error. And finally, before we pause to summarize, the current slide includes changes that apply only to the WWC standards version 4.1. First, the WWC single case design standards are no longer designated as pilot standards. And on a related note, the new standards handbook now provides examples of situations that introduce confounds in single case designs, causing those studies to be rated as does not meet WWC single case design standards. For example, in a single case design context, a confound will be introduced if one teacher teaches all cases in the baseline phase and a different teacher teaches all cases in the intervention phase. Moving on to the next bullet, note that the standards now allow study authors greater flexibility in accounting for missing baseline data when in the context of an uncompromised randomized control trial. And finally, removed from the standards handbook is language stating that joiners pose no risk of bias when they're excluded from the analytic sample. With that, I will turn it over to Dr. Caverly for a summary of today's webinar.
Great, thank you, Dr. Taylor. Just to review, we identified 4 substantive updates to the What Works clearinghouse procedures and standards within version 4.1, including estimating effect sizes when multiple effects are present in a domain, using fixed effects meta-analysis for synthesizing effects across studies, determining effectiveness ratings within intervention reports, and calculating effect sizes for single-case design studies. In addition, we shared other notable changes in version 4.1 of the WWC standards and procedures. For a full summary of the version 4.1 updates, both substantive and noteworthy, please visit the What Works Clearinghouse website. The version 4.1 standards and procedure handbooks, as well as our responses to public comments, are available on the site. Let's turn to questions from our participants about the version 4.1 updates. Drs. Taylor and Valentine, thank you for addressing some questions during your presentation, and we have a few additional questions that we received as part of the registration process as well as in the chat box today. So the first one is, I am a certified What Works Clearinghouse reviewer under version 4.0 of the handbook. So I have to complete any new activities to be certified to conduct What Works Clearinghouse reviews under version 4.1. Dr. Valentine, can you help respond to that question?
Happy to. So the idea here is that reviewers who are certified under version 4.0 of the WWC standards and procedures will need to be recertified for version 4.1. If you wish to get recertified, you'll have to watch a video that we'll make available in February, and you'll need to complete a brief certification activity, emphasis on brief, because this involves answering a multiple choice question to assess understanding of the content covered in the recertification video. If you subscribe to the IES newsletter, you'll be alerted when that video is available.
Thank you, Dr. Valentine. Our next question is, I started certification for group design standards under version 4.0, but haven't completed it yet. Do I need to start over? Dr. Taylor, can you help us address that question?
Definitely. This is a good question, and basically one has two options. The first is that the online group design training modules and certification process will transition to version 4.1 this spring. So your first option is to complete the certification process before then, in which case you will be certified in version 4.0 of standards and procedures. Your next step would then be to get recertified under version 4.1, which includes viewing a video and completing a brief certification activity, which entails answering a multiple choice question to assess your understanding of the video content. Alternatively, your second option would be to watch the updated group design modules once they're available this spring. Then you can take the updated version 4.1 certification exam, and when you are done, you will be certified under version 4.1.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Taylor. Our next question is also focused on the recertification process, and it is, I am certified in group design standards under version 3.0. What should I do to certify under version 4.1? Dr. Valentine, will you take this question?
Yeah, it's another good question. So for people certified in group design standards under version 3.0, the fastest option is to recertify under 4.0 first. To do that, you'll need to watch the 3 modules that are available at the link that we'll post in the chat box now, and then you'll need to complete a 10-item recertification test. However, this option is only available until January 31st. If you recertify under 4.0 by then, you can then watch the 4.1 recertification video when it becomes available, and then complete the brief certification activity, and you'll be recertified under 4.1. If you don't recertify from 3 to 4.0 by January 31st, then you'll be required to complete the entire 4.0 certification process, and that's outlined in the link that we are now posting in the chat box. And then after you complete the 4.0 certification, you'll be able to recertify under 4.1 by watching the video and completing the brief recertification activity.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Valentine. Also, I noted we had a question about recertification in the chat box, wanting to clarify the difference between today's webinar and our recertification video. And they are 2 different sources of information. As you'll recall, today's webinar was meant to be a broad overview, and the statistics website and training team is in the process of finalizing the recertification video that will be posted to the WWC website, as well as have a follow-up activity to help support the recertification process. And we anticipate that near the end of January, early February, and all currently certified reviewers will receive an email when that is available, so they can access it very easily. Let's turn to the next question that we have. It says, will studies previously reviewed under version 4.0 of the handbook be re-reviewed under version 4.1? Dr. Taylor, can you answer this question for us?
I can, Sarah, thank you. So if a study was reviewed under version 2.0 or earlier, it will be re-reviewed under certain conditions, and that is if it was included in a new WWC product or it was submitted as evidence as part of a grant competition. On the other hand, studies that were reviewed under later versions, including version 4.0, will not be re-reviewed. Now, in terms of applying the new 4.1 handbook versions to new reviews, that will begin later in 2020.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Taylor. We've also noticed a few questions come through the chat box in regards to the online study review guide and the timing of when it will be updated and incorporating the formulas needed to calculate the fixed effects approach to synthesizing effect sizes in the same outcome domain. And the timing of that will be over the summer. The statistics website and training team is currently working on updating all of the formulas and aligning the online study review guide for both group design as well as also single case will be updated and available over the summer to support the transition into conducting reviews using version 4.1. I also see in the chat box that we have a question about the ESSA evidence tiers and how they were incorporated into the new standards and procedures. which is actually a fantastic question, and we will be engaged in providing a webinar in March that will further explore that and share more details about how the tiers were built in, as well as the tools that we have to support searching and identifying those interventions that align with that. All right, so today's webinar, I think that concludes all of the questions that we have thus far. So our webinar will be archived on the What Works Clearinghouse website along with the questions and answers. Additional resources can be found on the What Works Clearinghouse website, including the version 4.1 handbooks and previous webinars focused on the What Works Clearinghouse handbooks. If we did not get to one of your questions today in the chat box, or if you have additional questions, please know that we will address those and post those with the webinar archive. And if you have additional questions about the WWC reviewer certification or the recertification process, we encourage you to submit your questions to the WWC Help Desk. This concludes our time for the webinar today. I would like to thank all of you for joining us and our presenters for deepening our knowledge of the version 4.1 updates to the What Works Clearinghouse standards and procedures. As a reminder, the statistics website and training team engages in webinars throughout the year to highlight important aspects of the What Works Clearinghouse standards and procedures. Our planned webinars vary in topics. However, all have the goal of deepening What Works Clearinghouse knowledge. We anticipate at least 2 more webinars this year, one of which will focus on ESSA tiers of evidence and the What Works Clearinghouse, as well as then single case design and design comparable effect sizes within the context of the new SCD standards. To learn more about webinars offered by the What Works Clearinghouse and IES, be sure to sign up to receive notices through the IES listserv. In the meantime, please reach out to the What Works Clearinghouse Help Desk with questions related to the version 4.1 standards and procedures, as well as the recertification process. Thank you for joining us.